So we are live now. Greetings from India. My name is Stella Chitralekha Biswas, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I am an assistant for the current project of Tell Me Your Story and state-aided college teacher at the Department of English, Sarojini Naidu College for Women, Kolkata. I welcome you to the stories of food and drinks, shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review September 2022, in collaboration with the York Center for Asian Research, York University, and Readomania. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Sayan, Dr. Richard H. Schwartz, and Dr. Avishek Parui, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is religious history of food consumption under the sub-theme religious practices and their influence on food consumption behavior. All of the panelists are experts in their area with many years of professional experience. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Sayan. Dr. De grew up in Kolkata, West Bengal, and is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at WIT Center for Diversity Studies, University of Witwatersrand. He is also the head of Gender Equality Mandate, Center for Regional Research and Sustainability Studies, India. His areas of research interests are post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, race studies, food humanities, and critical diversity literacy. He can be reached at www.shayonde.com. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Richard H. Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz, PhD, is the author of Vegan Revolution, Saving Our World, Revitalizing Judaism, Judaism and Vegetarianism, Judaism and Global Survival, Who Stole My Religion, Revitalizing Judaism and Applying Jewish Values to Help Heal Our Imperiled Planet, and Mathematics and Global Survival, and over 250 related articles at jewishveg.org/Schwartz. He's President Emeritus of Jewish Veg and also Associate Producer of the video, A Sacred Duty, Applying Jewish Values to Help Heal the World. He will be joining us shortly. Our third speaker for the session is Dr. Avishek Parui. Dr. Parui, PhD, Durham University, is Assistant Professor in English at IIT Madras and Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is the Principal Investigator at the Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras, and founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies, INMS. He is the author of Postmodern Literature's Orient Black Swan 2018 and Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, published by Rowman and Littlefield 2022. He is currently contracted with Brill to edit the Indian Handbook for Memory Studies and with Orient Black Swan for a monograph titled Memory Studies. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
So now we open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Sayan to share his insights. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, Stella, Tell Me Your Story team, and also a very warm hello to Dr. Parui. So nice to see you. And so as I have been kind of suggested by the Tell Me Your Story team to focus on three aspects. One is with respect to my article on decolonization and food, which I co-authored with Rosina Mart, a critical race studies scholar based in South Africa. And then I'll move into, with respect to my current research on the African diaspora in India and the Indian diaspora in Africa. So I'll just share a bit of fragment of that in connection with food and culinary practices, and also to the aspect of deracialization as well. And then towards the end of my reflections, I'll talk about how food blogging has emerged as a very powerful medium of unpacking various food cultures which are not very apparently visible to us because of various hierarchical reasons. But food blogging is in a way interrogating such hierarchies in food cultures and culinary practices. So beginning with the first point, So when I wrote this article about decolonization and food, one aspect among several aspects, one aspect that we focused on was the aspect if we can really make a very strict categorization between colonized food and decolonized food, especially in the current contemporary context, because we see that most of the food items, irrespective of our cultural affiliations, irrespective of our geographical affiliations, the kind of food items that we consume on a daily basis, they are basically very interwoven with different food cultures and traditions, not only within one particular country, but across geographical borders. So that was one of the many elements that we thought about. And one interesting aspect while talking about the different dimensions of the colonial influence of foods and the consistent effort to decolonize food was also the question of the kitchen. And one thing that we actually understood, both in the context of India and South Africa, is that the very aspect of the public kitchen, and public kitchen in the sense is in the pre-colonial times. If you look at the Indian kitchen space in the pre-colonial times, it was not apparently obviously a public kitchen space, but it was somewhere in between, because there were open kitchen spaces which were mainly architecturally positioned. They were constructed mainly towards the roads, and we also learn stories and narratives from our parents, and at least I know those stories and narratives from my grandparents and parents, that how often the passers-by who were strangers, maybe they would be hungry, they would be thirsty, and they would never hesitate to approach an open kitchen space in a private home to ask for water or for some food, which was a very natural form of cultural exchange, a natural way of showing respect, love, and towards every people in the social space. But the thing is, what we currently see within this aspect of kitchen space is it's a very private affair. I mean, obviously, not I'm not generalizing with every kitchen space, because we also know that in many homes now, open kitchen spaces are made where where the dining table is merged, where the dining space is merged with the kitchen space, and the foods are being served openly, where the guests can come in and they can see what is being cooked and what is being prepared. But in many houses, we see that the kitchen space is actually an extremely private space, where it's kind of shielded from the view of the outsiders, from the view of the people from the outside the home who are coming in the home. As if, but, and why I find this problematic, again, it's a very complex narrative, where personally, why I found this problematic, and I've talked about that in that article as well, with respect to in the context of India, that the kitchen space historically across the world, across the indigenous communities, have always been a space of a kind of creating a language, a form of exchange, a way of de-hierarchization, not in every aspect but to a lot of aspects, and also a kind of space which is also to a vast extent free from many forms of power structures and social injustices. And as I mentioned categorically, that to a certain extent, not every not every aspect. So that has been the part of the traditional pre-colonial kitchen space, where you see the free flowing of interactions, you see the free flowing of exchanges, a form of new language that is shaped around tastes and spices and culinary practices, which somewhere somewhat has got disrupted with this very privatized structure of kitchen space. Obviously, the question of hygiene has always been there, but it is always more than that. It's also about a form of culture. It's also about a form of imitating the Western architectural patterns, the Western cultural patterns. And it's a very complex, as I'm saying, a very complex and interwoven narrative to talk about. And there are so many other examples. But to cut a long story short, this is one aspect which I criticized in that particular article, that why the current very privatized, compartmentalized kitchen spaces in many homes are a form of a cultural, kind of unpack a very culturally fragmented state, as compared to those traditional pre-colonial kitchen spaces, which used to be a kind of in between culturally in between the private and the public kitchen spaces. Now, moving into the next aspect, and which, I mean, since one of my areas of interest is obviously food humanities. So again, in my present postdoctoral research as well, what I'm looking at, one of the many aspects of creolized practices that I'm looking at is the culinary creolized practices of the Indian diaspora in South Africa and the African diaspora in India, with a specific reference to the space of Gujarat. So there also, what is interesting, and we know that briefly, those of us who are working widely with the Indian Ocean world diaspora with respect to the transatlantic diaspora, we know one thing, that these diasporic spaces have always have a vast history of fluid and porous cultural exchanges. And also we know how the diaspora across different world in different contexts, in different socio-cultural and historical contexts, have been racialized in various ways. So in a similar pattern, talking about one small fragment of my current research, the African diaspora in India has undergone multiple forms of racial discriminations across different times, from the colonial times till the contemporary times. They still experience. And the various forms of resistance that they have generated, the various forms of cultural, social, and other forms of resistance that they have generated. One is obviously with respect to the question of food. And the creolized food practices in which they actually retain some of the consumption patterns of their ancestors from Africa, and they intermix those patterns with respect to the contemporary and also widely the traditional consumption patterns of the local Indian social structure where they are based is actually quite interesting. And this way of creating a form of resistance is also not only peaceful, but at the same time, it's also very dialogical in nature, because we often know resistance can also be very violent. Resistance can also be a form of closure. So the creolized food practices, for instance, in Karnataka, if we specifically look at the Siddhi community in Karnataka, they have these very interesting, what they call the red ant chutney. Now the consumption of red ants, apart from, is a very common feature amongst many indigenous communities in India and Africa, and the Siddhi community in Karnataka, they inherited this practice from their African ancestors. But they also prepare the red ant chutney by mixing it with various spices, from the local spices like ginger, garlic, and different from spice powders, and also many spices that they collect from the forest areas. So this is a very interesting form of creolized practice, which actually has also developed has kind of opened up gateways, for people, the local people, to come into the community and interact with them and kind of, get a taste of their food habits and cultural practices. And one last aspect with which I would like to conclude my reflection is that is the aspect of the food blogging. And today we see there are a lot of wonderful food blogs across the country. There are local food blogs, there are international food blogs, and food blogs focused on the street foods, food blogs focused on roadside hotels, which actually kinds of unpack not only some of the not so familiar culinary practices, but also the kind of unpack the stories behind it, that how did these culinary practices came into existence. And we see multiple forms of stories connected to the question of partition, connected to the question of gender discriminations associated with the aspect of caste hierarchies, so on and so forth. So food blogging is another wonderful form of resistance, of wonderful platform that kind of generate a tangential space, which kind of invites us to deviate from the mainstream hierarchies of consumption practices of both food and drinks, and look into this so known and often not so known food habits and drinking practices. So yes, thank you so much, all of you, for listening to me, and I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful observations, sir. I would now request Dr. Parui to share his observations. Over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stella, and thank you very much, Dr. Dave, for a really interesting opening. It'll be a tough act to follow after this. But I'll just stay to the basics, and I've been given some really interesting questions by the organizers, which are actually quite provocative, and which I'm hoping to connect and draw on and hopefully establish a narrative through which we can engage with food, memory, and diaspora. So I'll just draw on the questions sent to me. So the first question was about the relationship between food, memory, and diaspora. The second was about
Sir, if I might interrupt for a moment. So the questions are to be discussed only in the Q&A session that is going to be going to follow this.
Sure. My apologies. So I think we just I'll just make it philosophical and theoretical then, and probably take off from where Dr. Day just left off, which is looking at the relationship between food, identity, and memory. Well, the first thing that we need to know about food, and that's the most interesting thing, is that food is an entanglement of materiality and abstraction. Every food, every item which is cooked through a culinary process and consumed through the same process, it can have, usually does have, real metabolic, biological, like physical, corporeal quality. At the same time, it also extends onto abstract qualities, which includes memory, identity, all kinds of cultural associations. So and that's why it becomes really interesting, that problematic of food and memory, because what gets consumed sometimes, whether it's a diasporic community, whether it's a migrant community, whether it's a traveling community, or whether it's just a multicultural setting, what gets really interestingly foregrounded is how food is never just about the corporeal culture of eating and cooking, but also about assertion, articulating a certain kind of identity, marking a certain kind of identity. Now, what that obviously connects to, through a very problematic process sometimes, is a question of hygiene, the question of, let's say, purity. And of course, we all know purity ontologically as well as experientially can very quickly connect to politics around identity, the pure food, apropos of the non-pure food. And of course, those extend into other kinds of markers, which are sometimes quite sinister in quality. But what that obviously means is that there's a certain kind of coded quality about food. And I'm very interested primarily as a researcher in the coded quality around food preparation, especially food that is associated with certain kind of community practices, community identities. How coded is the whole process, the whole culture of cooking, consuming, etc. And that coded quality gets extended onto, like I just mentioned, in different kinds of identity practices. And the use the word identity practices quite consciously. At the same time, one has to bear in mind that almost every preparation of food, every kind of coding of food, it tries to create, especially the food around identity practices, it tries to create the fantasy of a pure genesis point, the fantasy of a pure identity point, the fantasy of a pure unity point. Whereas in reality, the whole ontology of preparing food and consuming food is just the reverse, right? Because food practices are always already entangled in very, very mixed material cultures, right? Whether it's a utensil, whether it's a kitchen, whether it's an arrangement of people. So it's always a mixed practice. So this fantasy of purity, the fantasy of unity, the fantasy of a pure identity emerging out of a certain kind of food practice is something to be studied as a cultural practice, sometimes an identity practice, sometimes an ideological practice. And of course, we have seen in various instances across the world where banning certain kind of food or promoting certain kind of food have become profound political acts, right? So that's the whole point about the fantasy of purity, the fantasy of a certain kind of identity, which has to be foregrounded, hegemonized, etc. Now, the very commonsensical understanding of food and memory is, and the way it connects is the very Roman Jacobsonian kind of a way, through metonymy and metaphor, right? So food can be seen as a metonymy practice, and food can also be seen as a profoundly metaphoric practice. So a food can be a metaphor for a community, an identity, whether it's a diasporic identity, etc. And that metaphor can obviously have some profound and complex material investments in terms of what goes inside the food, how is it prepared, how is it encoded, in other words, how is it consolidated, and of course, how is it consumed, the very hierarchical process, the very coded process through which it is done. But at the end of the day, it is a profoundly metonymic thing. So a little part can represent a whole synodic metonymic, however you want to define it, but it is a very, very partial process, right? And this partiality around food production is very interesting, because what is immediately evident at a theoretical level Is that a plate of a certain kind of food? Is a partial production of a certain kind of a holistic identity, which is fantastic, which is ideational, and which is obviously aspirational in quality. And of course, the other thing that food does, apropos of memory, quite scientifically actually, is that the whole idea of the sensory quality of food, the sensory quality of eating and smelling food, which can generate memory, nostalgia of all kinds, and also some kind of a time traveling. I mean, Marcel Proust made this famous, didn't he? The whole Madeleine episode. But that is something which we see constantly re-emerging in diasporic literature in terms of how a smell of a certain kind of food, a sniff or a preparation of certain kind of a partial food can take you back to a time which seems to have been lost. So that is a very chronotopic quality that we need to identify in food practices. How food can be a metaphor and a metonymy of space and time, an entanglement of space and time, and how the material production of food and the material consumption of food doesn't just stay at a material level, but it extends into more metaphorical, more affective, more more generative registers through which certain kinds of identity productions and reproductions can be perpetuated. Now, having said that, if you just take a quick look in terms of how food has been globalized and food has been technologized in recent times, in terms of how the technology around food ordering, the technology around food production, the technology around food consumption, whether it's the apps, the different ubiquitous apps we have in our smartphones through which you can order different kinds of food. So that's a very interesting narrative that is emerging in recent times. And ironically, the pandemic seems to have accelerated that, where the whole idea of consuming food just becomes a more of a technologized process. You do it through a smartphone, through a tap of the app, and you order it and it gets delivered at your home. Now, what that does, obviously, it makes the whole consumption production process very distributive in quality. And that's a technology around food. In terms of how the food getting delivered at your home instead of you going to a special meal outside. That obviously has some very complex replications about the whole sociality around food, the whole get-together quality around food, the entire ritual of surrounding food and producing a certain kind of a banquet-like quality. That becomes more distributed, more fluid in quality, right? And that also does away with the hierarchical, strict coded quality through which food can be prepared, right? And that creates a different kind of nostalgia as well in terms of, the lament for a past where food was pure, the lament for a past where food was, created by, prepared by the mothers and the grandmothers. And again, it's quite gendered. If you notice, that nostalgia is a heavily gendered nostalgia. That, the grandmother of a certain family used to make this food. Now that's gone entirely with her demise. So that nostalgia is very gendered in quality. That nostalgia is very utopian in quality. It was probably never there, but that is created, the fantasy is created as some kind of a ontological counterpoint, as it were, to the heavily technologized consumption of food that we have today. So I'll just stop it at this point, but I think it's a really interesting topic because it has profound replications around cultural identity, technologized identity, and also algorithmized identity. I think in culture studies, we need to take into account all of us are always already algorithmized in a certain sense, right? And the entire algorithm of food production and consumption in terms of what you order, what gets prompted on your phone, that has some very interesting in a study of bias, study of different kind of an identity emerging, which is not just cultural, ethnic inequality, but also I think it's probably a different term which might emerge in theoretical discourse in the times to come. So I'll stop it at this point, and I'm open to some discussions and questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insightful observations, sir. Dr. Richard Schwartz has unfortunately not been able to join us so far. So I'll move on to the question and answer session, and we'll just wait for him if he is able to join later on. My first question is for Dr. Sayan. You have already talked about your perspectives on the shift from the pre-colonial Bengali kitchen to the as a welcoming public space to the private space of the family kitchen gradually. So do you consider this shift as contributing to a different kind of hierarchization, in a certain way, especially if we look at it within the context of the traditional Hindu setup? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a very important that you brought in, Stella, because you know what, if we need to look at the shift in the usage and the performances of the kitchen spaces, we need to look at it in an intersectional way. as we look at the architectural transformation, and architectural transformation is also a form of cultural transformation. A cultural transformation also involves multiple levels of, racial, caste, class, gender, and multiple forms of transformation. So also, it's, I mean, keeping aside any form of theory, if you simply visit different forms of houses, what you will see is based on one's class. You see the structure of the kitchen spaces, the way it is, and especially in this era of modular kitchens, you see the way it has been modeled, the way it has been structured, the way it has been positioned. Still, if you are for instance, if I take the examples of kitchen spaces in a majority of the rural areas in India, you see the kitchen spaces are still like a very public space where women from different households, they will come, they will cut the vegetables together, or they will prepare the pickles together. And also, I mean, as Dr. Parui rightly mentions, that it's a very gendered kitchen space where you see certain gender, certain age groups are expected to play a certain role. But also, there's this interactive element. Widely in general, this interactive element that was very much visible in the pre-colonial traditional kitchen spaces of India is kind of missing, is very much missing. In many houses, you see that the kitchen space is positioned in such a way, it's so structured in a closeted manner that you feel unwelcomed there, as if the very structure is kind of sharing with you that that you are not allowed to enter that kitchen space. And then there are whole sorts of caste dimensions in terms of kitchen spaces. Who has the right, who has the authority to cook, who has the authority to go in and wash the kitchen space, the clean the kitchen space. You have the caste dimensions as well, we have the gender dynamics as well. And also in terms of, as I was sharing, in terms of cultural transformations, it is also where, whom do you think can be allowed into the kitchen space based on one's culture, based on one's caste identity, based on one's class identity as well. The high class, low class, the middle class dynamics also come into the kitchen space. So as I was sharing at the time of my presentation, obviously it's a very complex space. It's very difficult to kind of make a clear cut division about all these dynamics, but they're also at the same time very intersectional and interwoven with each other. So I mean, if you have to understand this cultural transformation, and as you talked about in the question of hierarchy, we have to look this all sort of hierarchies all together, which are kind of entangled with each other.
Thank you very much for answering that. My next question is for Dr. Parui. How do you look at the consumption of religiously prescribed food as a sort of negotiation with the larger politics of health and agency in the contemporary scenario?
Yeah, I mean, religion and food have a common space, right? And that is the coded quality. And that connects very quickly to the question of hygiene, the question of purity, the question of access and agency. So I think that is the major overlap the religion and food have. And if you look at the whole idea of the religious kitchen, whether it's a kitchen associated with a religious space, you find that different kinds of identity markers are just foregrounded spectacularly in those spaces. So I think it just comes down to the question of codedness, and this is why I think the whole idea of religion and food both are such interesting vectors in memory studies, right? In terms of how certain kinds of memory, certain kinds of identity are encoded through certain very, very closed and exclusive rituals, which are not publicly available, which are not, recipes are not shared in a public space. Recipes are secret recipes, which are transmitted, only accessible to certain kinds of identity markers. So that's the basic and fundamental overlap the religion and food have. But having said that, and this is the complexity of capitalism in a certain sense, even that too has been, in recent times, you can find that even religious cuisine or temple cuisine or whatever that is, can be capitalized and made into some kind of a commercially consumable product, right? Which can feature in certain kinds of restaurants, which can feature in certain kind of commercial, non-religious, perhaps, if I may say so, secular spaces as well, right? So that again becomes very problematic, because that apparently does away with the whole idea of the sacrality of the coded process, right? And makes it available in a very capitalist kind of a way to everyone who has access to the capital and the money, and essentially you pay for it and you get it, right? So I think that the entanglement of the the pure coding of a certain kind of a recipe, which is marked with certain kind of identity, and how that is undercut and problematized by the rampant commercialization through which those recipes can become more distributive in quality. And that interplay is something to be studied, and that perhaps would reveal some very interesting interventions in apropos of food and religion.
Thank you very much for answering that, sir. My second question is for Dr. De. This question is with regard to the immensely popular culture of food vlogging that you have just talked about. So do you think that, the way in which, the beliefs and the behaviors surrounding the production and the consumption and the distribution of food have been reconfigured through these, very popular practices in the recent times have sort of contributed to a bridging of gender differences to a certain extent? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, at least I personally cannot deny the fact that to a certain extent, the gender differences have been bridged, considering the fact with respect to like how more males are now interested to cook food, not only just at the level of a chef. I mean, that aspect of chef has always been very patriarchal again. You hardly find women chefs today even, but the numbers are increasing, but still it's very male dominated space. I'm talking about the usual regular domestic space where more and more males are interested in cooking. They take interest in writing cookbooks. We also, if we go through the social media spaces where we see that it's not just the women who are preparing and making recipes and sharing, but also it's a male also who are taking enthusiasm in talking about that. So, well, yes, in that sense, the popular culture has actually transformed this whole gender dynamics that women are meant for cooking and males are meant for working. This very problematic dynamics to a certain extent has been challenged, but also every aspect has its own positive and negative side. So the thing is, it's also the popular culture, it's also the aspect of in a certain way, especially with respect to the aspect of social media, what we see, it's sometimes it's less interest, it's a less genuine interest towards cooking and preparing and serving people, but it's a more interest of gaining a kind of fast track popularity where you can share a recipe, you can gain a few likes and shares. And this is also something which is also drives a lot of male to kind of indulge in this kind of cooking, which I find is, in a way, if it is at all, again, it's a very complex question to think around, but if it is at all in a way challenging the gender dynamics, or on the contrary, it is just kind of extension of preserving that obviously males can cook, but they will only cook in special spaces in the time of special occasions, and females are for the regular cook. So I see both the sides, but obviously I can't deny the fact that to a vast extent this problematic gender dynamics that the women are meant for cooking and males are not meant for cooking has been challenged to a vast extent.
Thank you very much for answering that. My next question is for Dr. Parui. How do you think the recent food consumption practices, especially the sort of growing interest in dining out culture, are going to be affected by this renewed emphasis on the localized practices and the memories of long lost recipes?
It's interesting because I can speak for Calcutta, and that is, we find that if you look at the new restaurants which have cropped up in Calcutta, and I'm sure that's probably the same for almost all the metros, they are not, it's interesting, they're not really Chinese restaurants or continental restaurants, but rather those are nostalgic restaurants, right? So those are restaurants which are sort of banking on the edible chronotop, as it were, right? In terms of preparing and presenting to you a lost recipe cooked by the grandmothers of yore. And again, this is very gendered. No one talks about the grandfather's cooking, but the whole idea of, and also the artwork in those restaurants. If you take a look, the artwork is very clearly gendered in terms of how you find an old woman dressed up in very old Bengali apparel, cooking food. And the whole idea is you step into the space not just to consume the food, but to consume the metaphoricity of the food. And that's what I meant in my when I did touch upon this in my opening. That food is not just about, especially cultural food consumption, it's not just about eating the corporeal, physical food, it's also the metaphoricity around the food, right? So what exactly are you consuming? You're consuming a certain kind of identity, you're consuming a certain kind of nostalgia, you're consuming a certain kind of, essentially time travel, as it were, right? So time travel in a literal sense, you smell something and you travel back in time, but at the same time, you eat an old recipe and that is supposed to transport you back to some pre-colonial or whatever time it advertises itself as. But that, I think, is interesting, because that is where the capitalist investment around food seems to be at the moment, right? Not so much about cropping up for continental restaurants, but rather going back in time and digging out the pure Indian recipes, the pure Bengali recipes, the pure Maharashtrian recipes, whatever. And again, the question of purity becomes interesting. And the more invested the restaurant, the more invested the eating spaces are, the more they would like to foreground the cultural purity of the food. And that can go into really different directions. That can go into directions as in who is doing the cooking in the kitchen, what is the identity marker. Some restaurants will proudly flag up the fact that the kitchen is maintained by a certain kind of people, certain demography, as it were, right? Although you have to be careful about that, because that might land you in trouble as well. But there is that tendency to create a certain kind of identity marker around the spaces of consumption. And the point is to, entice the consumer to some kind of a time traveling. And of course, it's a completely capitalist method, right? So, but the interesting thing is that capitalism over here is not so much Eurocentric or futuristic, but rather it is more going back in time. And that's where the wealth of food lies. And that's where the uniqueness and purity of food seems to be. So, yeah.
Thank you for your observation, sir. The last question is open for both of you to comment on. Could you elaborate on the need to return to religious values and principles in the visions of a sustainable future based on ethical food habits? So, Dr. Dey, if you would like to comment on that first.
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about this aspect. If and also obviously the skepticism comes from my personal positionality. To clarify at the very beginning. See, again, it's very difficult for me to take one particular side, but let me, unpack it as I understand in my own complex way. Obviously, the food habits that are based on the religious values, it's respectful. I mean, if one has their own religious values, they follow the certain kind of food habits, it's respectful. But what really emerges as problematic is when those one's own personal beliefs are kind of channelized and imposed widely as the usual belief, as the usual norm, by disbanding, by rejecting all the other forms of food habits and practices. And obviously, in the contemporary socio-political context of our country, and also in many other parts of the world as well, we see this has been happening for quite some time, where certain selective, and again, it is entangled in the question of politics as well, the politics power, the social injustice issues, and all those sorts of hierarchies, where you see that certain food habits, selective food habits, are being projected as the genuine one. And if certain communities and individuals, certain religious communities and or political individuals are not following that, then those people becomes the target. In multiple ways they are being targeted. So the thing is, obviously, I don't want to say that no, we shouldn't think about the religious values should be taken into account as a part of food habit, or I also don't want to take another corner. But somewhere I think it's very complex in the sense that, okay, if somebody, even if I don't affiliate to that, it's respectful. But my challenge is only, my problem with this aspect is only if those certain religious beliefs and practices are being promoted as the only genuine one, and the rest are being kind of submerged and subdued and silenced. So I think I'll leave it here.
Right. I more or less endorse what Dr. Dey just said, because see, the problem with religious values is that they're quite territorial in quality as well, right? So you don't quite know where value A ends and value B begins, right? And that territoriality is related to the space, the sacrality of a space, and that will create its own ritual. Now, having said that, if you go back to the fundamentals of religion, I mean, religion as a evolutionary practice, religion as something, a faith system which has helped the primate who we are to evolve to where we are at the moment. So that has obviously been promoted with inclusivity, empathy, charity, in terms of helping out someone less fortunate than you. So those values obviously have been absolutely key, in evolutionary process. So we wouldn't be where we are if we didn't subscribe to those values. So I wouldn't do away with that, the whole idea of religion institutionally as well, because I think it does play a very vital role in any cultural evolutionary system. It is a major engine of culture. One has to sort of not deny that at all. But in terms of looking back at institutional religion as a promoter and producer of food practices, and going back to the grammar book of religion, as it were, and making it more mainstream, that might actually kick a can of worms, as it were, right? Because the way I look at it now, it's just getting more and more secularized in quality. Like, for instance, if you're traveling in a railway or in a flight, irrespective of your identity, you can order a Hindu X meal, the Muslim Y meal, depending on what you want to buy, what you want to pay for, right? And that is fine. That is actually nice, I think, because it doesn't matter. No one's going to question you in terms of where your location is. That kind of a religiosity of food, that kind of religious access, that's absolutely wonderful, I think. That will promote inclusivity, that will promote plurality, etc. But where I would be careful about, and this is why I absolutely endorse what Dr. Day was also saying, is the territoriality of religious food, in terms of how I make it more expansive in quality. So it doesn't stop at territory A, it just keeps getting more and more expansive, till the point where I begin to legislate it in a form of a grand narrative. Like, you ban this because it doesn't, come under the purview of this religion. But that becomes problematic. But in terms of looking at religious values, being entangled with food, in terms of looking at religious values through forms of charity, empathy, fellow feeling, sympathy, and helping out, I do think religion has historically played a very, very big role in terms of food production, whether it's the gurdwaras or the mosques or the temples, where the inclusivity in terms of feeding the unfortunate, that has been a vital role in every cultural system. But where one has to draw the line, I think, is where that religiosity begins to become politicized, and where ideology comes in through different kinds of discourse markers, and that's where it becomes problematic. So I would leave it at that.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking comments, Dr. Day and Dr. Parui. Dr. Schwartz has just informed us that he is joining in a second. So if you could just, if we could wait for him a couple of minutes more. And in the meantime, if you would like to add to whatever you have already said, then you're welcome to do so.
I don't know. Would you like to go ahead, Dr. Parui, or you want me to go ahead? Both ways, it's fine.
Please go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I think, and I think this is something what Dr. Parui also shared is very important, that it's necessary to kind of understand and value and respect each other's food habits and culinary practices, because it might happen, and it's a very common sight, in fact, across the world as well. Recently, there has been a flood in Durban, and when they were sending out food packets as a part of the help, there was a whole lot of controversy that who is cooking the biryani. For instance, they were packing biryani. Who is cooking the biryani? Why it is being served less? Why it is being served more? So and within those kind of controversies, the problems that were coming up with this whole sort of experience that it is being cooked by a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or whatever, the taste and all those sort of stuff. So, and that's why I mentioned that it's not only just a problem in contemporary India, but it's also, across the world. So, this is actually a very sensitive issue. So, but we also need to understand that even if we don't affiliate, we talk a lot of agree to disagree, the question of agree to disagree. But in terms of application, we hardly see that's there in terms of application in our real life. So, and this kind of sensitization, it's not just required, at the theoretical level. This form of sensitization is required at the very basic social domestic level, like right starting from our homes. And I think this transformation will require a lot of time, because, no positive things in a short span of time. It requires a lot of time to, build that transformation. But what is really necessary for us to start thinking around these in an urgent way, and again at the very institutional or the theoretical plane, but right from our houses, that how do we school our people around, how do we understand the people around, that how to be build a real conviviality around the question of food and drinks. Because, if we look at the traditions of even the question of drinks as well, we see that the consumption of alcoholic drinks have never been a symbol of violence, have never been a symbol of problem in the indigenous communities. And still, like for instance, like when I was in Bhutan, I was teaching there, the very interesting thing is drinking locally brewed alcohols forms an integral part of their culture and traditions. Like even if there is a death at home, at the end of the day, they will sit together and drink to celebrate the life of the person who has passed away. So drinking has always been a culture of celebration, peace, and love. But now in the present context, if I even talk about the question of just alcoholic drinks, we see it just becomes a symbol of violence and a lot of other forms of violent imageries that are being generated through this whole narrative of alcoholic consumption. So it's necessary for us to kind of revisit those indigenous traditions and narratives, that how did these cultures emerge, and what was the basis for this emergence of this culture, to kind of understand our present scenario. Maybe Dr. Parui can add more into it.
Yeah, but absolutely. I think we need to look at the, so to speak, the industrialization of religion. Right? Not all religions have been industrialized, and when you talk about communities which are, let's say, somehow managed to retain the unindustrialized status, where the cultural consumptions are very different. But the moment religion and capitalism begin to merge, that's actually quite complicated, because then we have the question of territoriality, we have the question of spreading, we have the question of consumption through a commercial process, and it's just a short step into propaganda and dominance and hegemony, because you have the capital and you have the value system, and they're wedded together in ways which are quite complex and perhaps quite sinister as well, right? So we need to make a difference between religion as a non-industrial practice, religion as a purely value-based practice, which is based on hospitality, charity, empathy, and we need to take a very interesting look, perhaps a very careful look those religions which have been industrialized over time, those religions which have been commercialized in the ways which are almost global in quality, right? Where you have huge numbers of subscribers, where those religions get represented in Hollywood, Bollywood, they have this massive machines of representation. So those are religions we need to critique and be careful of, right? So we should not limit ourselves, because the problem is the moment you talk about religion, we think of Judeo-Christian religions and Hinduism, and that's it. Perhaps Buddhism as well. But there are just tons of millions of religions in different parts of the world which haven't become global or mainstream or commercialized or forms of entertainment, as it were, just because they haven't had the ideological or capitalist backing. And what about those religions, right? So what kind of food practices those religions have or enact? So I think that's a very complex question. But the very short answer to that would be we need to separate the value of a religion and the industrialization of religion, right? Because industrialization, commercialization will very quickly transform into ideology formation and constraint formation. And that's where the troubles begin to emerge.
We sincerely apologize for the delay. And there is one last question that I would like to ask both the speakers before we go on to the concluding section. How far do literary representations of the entanglements between food and memory adequately reflect upon the actual lived experience of migrants who have been forced to dislocate under socio-political emergencies?
Dr. Day, would you like to go?
Dr. Day, would you like to comment on that first?
Sure, Dr. Parui. Well, I mean, it is indeed a very important thing. I mean, I'll just give one very interesting example. So when the Indian indentured laborers started traveling to South Africa, and when they boarded the ships, they carried a lot of objects, whatever they could quickly carry with them as a part of their cultural memories. And amongst many things, one of them were carrying seeds of different indigenous plants, which obviously they were not sure of if they could avail those plants in South Africa. And when they actually carried those plants and the saplings, obviously many of the seeds got destroyed in the process of traveling. They used to be the very hectic process. But when they landed, and whatever they could kind of, preserve while traveling in the ship, they went there and planted around their, whichever small places they were staying. They wanted to, keep small plots of land to plant the seeds of certain plants, like the curry leaves, like the brinjals, like the mangoes, and like the and also of with respect to other kind of plants as well. And this is how they kind of not only grew seeds, grew plants, but as a way of remaining attached to their cultural memories as well. So food memory and migration, I think they are a very crucial aspect of each other, the way they kind of entangle each other. And today we see that mainly if we look around the places, if we go in Durban or any other parts of South Africa, and the way certain very traditional, Indian vegetables and Indian plants are available, this is one of the major reason, why it is available, because they were brought in by the indentured laborers as memories. So it's a very interesting, complex, but also an amazing kind of entanglement to see how food memory and migration kind of feeds into each other. But I think Dr. Parui will be in a much better space to talk about these aspects.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on, because when you talk about migration, it's not just about a seamless mobility. Migration occurs through refractions. And even nostalgia can take two different forms. And it can be a restorative kind of nostalgia, where you're just uncritically consuming the past, trying to bring it back. But it's also more reflective kind of nostalgia, where you are looking at the interruptions from the past. And the interruptions are not necessarily a bad thing. Those interruptions will become fault lines, where you can literally plant more seeds and grow different kinds of crops and plants. But I think where literature comes in a handy way is because the entire medium of literature is so heavily invested with imagination, right? You're creating a story, you're creating a plot, quite literally, you're creating a plot where you can plant all kinds of seeds, where you can grow all kinds of characters, all kinds of crops. Or it's the Robinson Crusoe story, right? The fantasy of territorializing the plot and literally occupying the novel's plot and also the island's plot. But when you come to diasporic literature, the whole idea of imagination plays a very crucial role. And what literature does, it gives a very interesting fillip to that imagination, right? In terms of looking at nostalgia, not necessarily as a retrospective quality, but also as an aspirational category, right? You look back to look forward in time, right? So you look back in terms of what you've lost, what you can regain, in terms of forging the future that might emerge in the times to come. So the metaphoricity of literature, the liminality of literature, the focalization literature offers in terms of who is telling the story, from which position the story is being told. So all these classical discourse of literature has, I think those lend a very interesting instrumentalization to the whole process of memory, nostalgia, food consumption, etc. So the very medium of literature is a very interesting medium through which food practices and the whole idea of cropping on a plot can actually have different kinds of material and metaphoric possibilities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dey and Dr. Parui, for your very enriching observations. With that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. We regret Dr. Schwartz not having been able to join us, but I thank each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you all for taking up time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on food and drinks, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.